Mr. President, are you going to cooperate with the...
No Republicans have raised concerns.
About the whistleblower, that the identity of the whistleblower should be protected.
I don't care. Look, I think a whistleblower should be protected if the whistleblower's legitimate. He either got it totally wrong, made it up, or the person giving the information to the whistleblower was dishonest. And this country has to find out who that person was, because that person's a spy, in my opinion.
A spy. The president in the Oval Office yesterday. Joining us now, former CIA Director John Brennan. He is a senior national security and intelligence analyst for NBC News. And in Washington, former DOD official, now an MSNBC national security analyst, Dr. Evelyn Farkas. Good morning to you both. Mr. Director, I want to ask you a question about Adam Schiff, because you're uniquely positioned to answer these questions. The chairman of the House Intel Committee reportedly learned about the Ukraine whistleblower's complaint against President Trump days before it was officially filed. According to the New York Times, citing a spokesman for Democrat Adam Schiff, along with current and former U.S. officials, the CIA officer, the whistleblower, approached a House Intel Committee aide with his concerns about the president only after first having a colleague relay them to the CIA's top lawyer. The Times says the officer approached the aide after becoming concerned about how the initial attempt to relay the allegations through the CIA was unfolding, adding that in both cases, the original accusation was vague. The Times goes on to say the House staff member, following the committee's procedures, suggested the officer find a lawyer to advise and meet with an inspector general with whom he could file an official whistleblower complaint. So, Mr. Director, let me just ask you about the way this was handled. Based on what you're reading in these media reports, based on what Chairman Schiff has said, was there any wrongdoing in the steps that were taken to get this whistleblower to file his complaint?
Well, I don't know if
his or her complaint.
I don't know if there was wrongdoing, but whenever an individual files a whistleblower complaint, it makes a lot of sense for them to go to a lawyer to get the legal advice in terms of how they go through the process, making sure that they adhere to the stipulations in the Whistleblower Act. So they would go to their lawyer in their component, and according to reports, that lawyer then talked to the CIA's general counsel. I don't know if that is the case or not, but these types of things should be kept very, very closely held. And it's my understanding that there is no reason at all for notification to be done to the White House or to the Department of Justice. You want to make sure it stays in those channels, you get that legal advice, and then it can be forwarded either through the Inspector General channels or directly then to the congressional committees.
Well, the president appears yesterday, and some of his supporters, to think he has a smoking gun, that Adam Schiff somehow orchestrated all this with the whistleblower. Adam Schiff says he came to us, he came to a member of my staff, and we said, go back and file an official report. Do you see anything wrong there with the way the chairman and the Intel Committee handled the whistleblower?
Again, I don't know the circumstances here, but I would think that the whistleblower who wants to get this information to Congress, if he or she feels as though they are being prevented from doing that, they're going to seek guidance from either lawyers as well as from a congressional committee. I want to get you something. How can I go about doing it? And if the guidance was then, well, submit it to the Office of the DNI's Inspector General, I think that is particularly, appropriate. And in this case, I think the right course of action.
On the Schiff matter, I spoke to someone close to the president last night who sort of used that language of smoking gun. And I think we all acknowledge that they're overstating it, but to their mind, this is an attempt, like they did so often during the Russia investigation, to take something. And Schiff, we heard him had to correct his comments, what he said on this show a few weeks ago, that he didn't speak exactly as he wanted. They're going to try to seize this as an attempt to just sort of muddy the waters, to make a distraction, to use the fog machine that they used so time and time again during the Russia probe. This will be something we're going to hear about in the days ahead.
Yeah, so, John, yesterday I was speaking to a former employee of yours when you were at the CIA about the process internally at the CIA that occurred with the whistleblower. Once removed, providing the general counsel with elements of what was in the document that we've all read now. Is there a CIA policy of how that should be handled? It was clearly sent to the White House, so the White House was alerted right away by the general counsel. What's the policy?
Well, the policy is to make sure you keep it within very closed channels. And it's my understanding that there is no policy whatsoever for the White House to be informed, especially since the White House officials are implicated in this. And that's why what the person needed to do was to try to get it into the system without going down to the White House Department of Justice, get it down to the congressional committees. So again, I don't know what happened inside of that, but the general counsel is a political appointee of Mr. Trump. And so I don't know whether or not that general counsel was informed and then decided, take it upon herself to notify people.
So were you surprised by it?
Well, I was surprised when I saw that the White House, Department of Justice, were informed about this whistleblower complaint in advance of it getting to the Inspector General and then getting down to the congressional committees. It is totally out of sequence.
So again, you were the director of the CIA. You're not aware of any policy that says you have to alert the White House when something like this comes across the general counsel's desk?
I am aware that there is no such policy.
Okay. Dr. Farkas, I want to ask you about Kurt Volker, the former special envoy to Ukraine, who will be testifying behind closed doors today, resigned, remember, just a few days ago. Remind, first of all, our viewers why he's a significant figure, and number two, I understand you have some reporting on what he might tell Congress today.
Yeah, I mean, Willie, so first of all, I've known Kurt for many years. He's a very well-respected diplomat in Washington, D.C. He started as a career diplomat. He heads the McCain Institute here in Washington, affiliated with Arizona State University. He's important because he took a job, kind of a part-time job, working for the Trump administration as the president's envoy to Ukraine. Mostly what that job meant was that he was responsible for working with the Russians and with the Ukrainians to try to tamp down the very hot war in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbas region. And that's separate from Crimea, which is, as we know, under Russian occupation. So Kurt has been all along trying to just, again, keep things on an even keel, maybe see if he can help bring the Russians and the Ukrainians closer to some kind of political agreement. And that's been his role. And somewhere along the line, as we know from the transcript of the phone call, the president wanted Rudy Giuliani to be put in touch with Ukrainian officials in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, and Kurt got involved. He got involved, as we know from Rudy Giuliani's text messages. He essentially put Rudy Giuliani in touch with some Ukrainians. Beyond that, we don't really know. That's the story, probably. Those are the facts that Kurt has to lay out today when he goes to give a deposition to the House Intelligence Committee, and I guess it's a joint investigation. So what I expect, knowing the man, is that he will cooperate completely, and he resigned from that position, which was the first indication that he probably would cooperate. The White House can no longer put any pressure on him, nor can the State Department. And so he's going to come and he's going to tell his account of what happened. My guess is that he was, to the extent that he understood that there was something nefarious that Rudy Giuliani may have been planning here with the president, he would have been trying to curtail the damage to the relationship, right? The man, Kurt, cares about democracy in America and in Ukraine.
So to remind people, Kurt Volker is the one who Rudy Giuliani posted the text and made those public. Rudy Giuliani said Volker is the one who connected him to Ukrainian officials in the government. Karine?
Yes, Director, I wanted to ask you, do you think that we will ever get the full transcript of the Ukraine call that the president had with the president of Ukraine?
Well, there is no recording, as far as I know, unless the policy in the White House has changed. But there are individuals who simultaneously transcribe the words. And looking at what was released by the White House, that looks like it was something other than what was contemporaneously transcribed at that time. So I don't know whether or not we're going to be able to get that, but there is more that at least at one point was there.
Claire McCaskill has a question for you. Claire?
John, let's back up here and look what's going on to the intelligence community in America. Let me start by saying everyone needs to realize the majority of people who work in the intelligence community are either veterans or even a lot of active military. And obviously, when you have Paul Manafort and Carter Page playing footsie with Russia and then becoming key in the Trump campaign, we would expect any intelligence community to take notice. What's going on now is really interesting. You have Lindsey Graham and the Attorney General of the United States basically asking our allies to investigate our intelligence community. That's a startling development. Isolated, it would be shocking. In this mess, it's not as shocking because people are not paying close attention to it. Talk about the impact this is going to have on our intelligence community long term and what they're feeling within the community right now as the president and important people in this country have turned the light and tried to say somehow they're the bad guys.
Yeah, Clara, I think you're absolutely right. I believe that this has hurt the morale within the intelligence community. These are women and men who sacrifice a great deal, and their families as well. And if they see that Mr. Trump is continuing to denigrate and disparage their work, and then go overseas and look for dirt on the intelligence community, or try to undermine what was the intelligence community's assessment that the Russians interfered in the election, I think that send a very chilling signal and a very disparaging signal to the intelligence community. But I also am concerned is what do the foreign intelligence services as well as governments take away from this? That the U.S. intelligence community cannot be trusted? Are they now going to stop the cooperation with the intelligence community because of what Mr. Trump is doing? The U.S. intelligence community relies heavily on the cooperation of intelligence security services around the globe. And if it looks as though the intelligence community is not being trusted by the administration, how does that then affect our work and the word of the intelligence community? When U.S. policymakers want to take some type of action overseas and they point to U.S. intelligence, if that U.S. intelligence is being undermined by the words of Mr. Trump, how then can the international community put stock in that? It has, I think, long-term damaging effects.
Evelyn, it's Jonathan Lemire, piggybacking on the director's point there. You're the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for including Russia. Yesterday, we heard Vladimir Putin jokingly talk about interfering with the election again in 2020. We've heard the president joke to Vladimir Putin during the sidelines of a summit in Japan this past summer, sort of sarcastically telling him not to do it, with no teeth behind it. As we're talking here about the president using his powers to dig up electoral dirt on Joe Biden, also, how concerned should Americans be that very little has been done to safeguard the next elections for an outside power, whether in coordination with the president or not, to try to meddle yet again?
Yeah, Jonathan, we should be very concerned. I mean, that's the bigger picture here. The Russian government is still trying to weaken our democracy. They are loving this. They are benefiting, first and foremost, from everything, all of this, from the smear on Ukraine, which in part probably came from them. I mean, someone's feeding Rudy Giuliani a lot of this garbage information, and I believe those people are close to the Kremlin, even if they're Ukrainian. So the Kremlin is benefiting from that. And then, of course, they're also benefiting even from this impeachment because it's creating a mess in our democracy. So, yes, we can expect them to continue to use whatever disinformation to try to spy on us and take the information out of campaigns and put it out in the public. All the dirty tricks, they haven't stopped.
Putin literally was laughing about it yesterday in Russia in an interview with our Keir Simmons. Evelyn Farkas, thank you. Director Brennan, thank you as well. Appreciate you being here this morning. Still ahead, we're bringing in a new panel to talk 2020. We're looking at some new polling that shows Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren locked in a tight race for the Democratic nomination. And as we go to break, a look at the latest issue of Time magazine, the new cover story about Senator Kamala Harris and where her presidential campaign stands. Morning Joe's back in a moment.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.